So this week I thought we'd talk about United Kingdom at Eurovision, and to paraphrase Live Report from 1989, why did we always get it wrong? In reference to why, since Gemini in 2003, have we not done as well as Eurovision as we had in past years? Having said that, this year Sam Ryder has changed the game for the United Kingdom. He won the jury vote, and today in the Junior Eurovision, Freya has smashed the televote and came out on top of that and came fifth out of 16, and for the first effort in, I think it's 16 or 17 years. So we'll talk about the positives in a little bit, but what are people's general feelings of where did it all begin to go wrong for the UK? Was it Gemini, or was it before that, or after that, or somewhere in between? What are people's general feelings on it?
I have thought about this question quite a bit over the last few years, and I think you have to go back to when the UK were doing really, really well at Eurovision, and I don't think it's that much of a coincidence that when the UK was doing really well, as like they were getting their victories, but they're also getting all their second places or their top 10 placings, it was during a time where one, it was less countries competing than it was now, but two, I think this is the more important thing. I don't think people really talk about this enough. It's when there was still the national language rule that was still in place at the time. So obviously, England, Ireland, Malta would have probably been the only countries who would have been allowed to enter songs in English. And I think because English is such a universal language for music, that's where I think the UK has sort of this natural advantage over everybody else. But I think what happened is that as I think as of 1999, when they scrapped the national language rule and then all countries were able to enter songs in English. I mean, we did okay. I think this is when we started to see some of the the lesser results. I think in '99 we UK came 12th. 2000, I think it was, I can't remember where Nikki French got, and I think it was the same with Lindsay Dracus in 2001, and I think it was Jessica Garland in 2002 was kind of sort of like the anomaly in that where they came equal third, but I think it was a trend. You were starting to see a trend since the national language rule was scrapped, where it was like, yeah, there is where like we're getting less and less and less points, and then Gemini happened in 2003, and I think since then it has been like, yeah, we don't seem to have that natural advantage of singing in singing in English anymore that the other countries previously didn't have. So I think that's been a big factor for us. But I would also agree that I think after a while there was a bit of a malaise that set in with the UK. I also think that basically in the 2000s, I think especially with more and more countries coming in, there was also the matter of Terry Wogan and his increasingly xenophobic commentary. As right up until the time where I think he just sort of just left, and then Graham Norton took over. And I think I personally think a lot of the apathy and I don't dare say the antipathy towards Eurovision in the UK in the 2000s and onwards, I attribute that directly to Terry Wogan and the attitude that he displayed during the 2000s when he was commentating. Because earlier on, he was a bit cynical, but he still enjoyed it. But you could see that by that time, he was just, I think he was just over it, and it showed. But those are just my observations of that. And I think it has taken a long time for the UK to kind of sort of just lift itself out of it. It was a self-perpetuating cycle for many years, just again, from the Terry Wogan years moving on. And it was just, this vicious cycle until, like you said, Sam went ahead and just broke that instantly and turned things around.
Patrick, if I could interrupt. You've obviously made some really good points there about the language rule has obviously not benefited us. And you've talked about Terry. I feel as though Terry is more a reason why fans don't like things as much. Sorry, non-fans, the casual viewers and things, why they don't like things as much. And I think we touched on that a little bit last week. We've had 20 years to try and correct this. And the language rule has been in effect for well over 25 years. We should have cracked this a lot earlier. So was it you've mentioned some factors, and I agree with some of them, but what about other things? What other people think about the standard of songwriting that we were submitting, the standard of artists that was taking part in our national finals? Were our national finals good enough? When we did things like Molly or Electro Velvet, were BBC Sounds, or whoever it was in charge at the time, were they really doing their best to send their best artists? And if they weren't, why weren't they?
Yeah, that's again a very, very, very good question. And again, coming back to sort of that time frame where we were sort of at a very low point, there were a couple of years where we sent some really, the UK sent some really quality stuff. I'm conscious not to say we because I'm an Aussie, so I don't want to feel like I'm representing the UK in this. But there were times where the UK actually were sending quality stuff, and it showed. Jay Dewan and Andrew Lloyd Webber in 2009. We got UK got back into the top 5. That was a quality song. And again, I would say, Molly as well in 2014, and even, God, her name escapes me. Never Give Up on You. What was her name? I completely forget. 2017.
Lucy Jones.
Thank you very much. It's just like her name just completely escaped my mind, and it shouldn't. But Lucy Jones was absolutely amazing. And that is what happens when you do send some quality and people do actually say, "Oh yeah, this is a song to take notice of." But I think one of the questions you asked, Pete, was why isn't the UK taking advantage of it? And I think this is something that Sam did really, really well this year. He marketed himself outside the UK so much. It was a good song, but wow, the promotional stuff that he did right across Europe, whether it was in Amsterdam, whether it was in Berlin, whether it was right across Europe, who was just doing a promotional tour and just getting his name out there. He got that. You couldn't just isolate yourself within the UK and just expect everybody to take notice of you. You really had to go out there and capitalize on that. When I was in Amsterdam this year for Eurovision in concert, I was just amazed at sort of the outreach that he was doing. During Eurovision concert himself, after his performance, he actually said, "Guys, listen up. I'm going to be at this place tomorrow afternoon at 4 p.m. If you know what I'm talking about, I'll see you there." 200 people showed up there the following day, and he did an absolutely amazing performance. So it's not just the big concerts, but it's the really grassroots kind of stuff as well. And Sam had that to a T. If the UK can take advantage of, they can get a good song, obviously, but if they can get the marketing right, like they did this year, they'll start going places again.
But I think Sam is a very special case because obviously he has a personal enthusiasm for this by the look of it. And we can't. I don't know who we're going to pick next, but we can't force them to sort of start busking in the streets and turning up at concerts like Sam did. And so anyone we pick, if we're saying that European enthusiasm and touring and busking is the way to do well at this, then the next artist either has to sort of match the intensity with which Sam marketed himself, or we have to do something different and accepting that they're not going to do those things.
Yeah, they don't have to necessarily follow the exact same template that Sam did, but they don't have to be out busking in the street or or whatever, but they do have to they've got to sort of find their own way to put themselves out there and make themselves known. And
Yeah.
I'm sure the UK delegation and everybody else will find a way to do that. That is right for that artist.
Yeah, like I agree. I think while Sam has obviously done like a lot out of his own like want, like extra promotion and stuff like the books being in the street, I do think as well this year we've seen the BBC be a lot more supportive than we have in like so many years. And I think for a long time there was like a general like apathy of like, oh, we'll enter, we don't have to do much. And I mean, I could be completely wrong, but I feel like people were fine with doing the bare minimum because in the UK, at least, Eurovision always draws in high viewing figures.
Mm-hmm.
There's never been, I don't think, a time where it's been like, we really need to turn this around. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do this anymore. We're going to have to withdraw because it is always one of the most watched shows here for a long, long time. And I think that eventually they just got like tired of sailing and like coming like near the bottom. Like I think the last few results were like embarrassing for like the BBC and the participants and just like the entire country. And I think finally there must have been just like someone there who was like, enough's enough. We can be doing so much better, especially as Eurovision has become like it's had its own resurgence. Like it's never been unpopular, but in the last few years we've seen the popularity of the show and like the success that artists and countries can get out of it just skyrocket. And I think finally someone's just been like, yeah, we want a piece of the pie now. We're no longer just going to sail through and be mediocre and do our like bare minimum. Let's go out and try.
I completely agree with every single word that everyone said. With Lily especially, I think it's all about the BBC's desire. Like Lily said, it's a very, very cheap evening's entertainment for the BBC to get a big audience, even when we come 25th, So, there was no motivation for so many years. And I think it was, like Lily said, it was the horrendous results, even by our standards, the last few years, and also seeing things like Måneskin and Arcade and Eurovision becoming massive. It's prompted them to do something this year, and long may it continue.
I agree with you all. I think it's been very easy as you just said, it's been very easy for the BBC to say it doesn't matter how we do because we're going to get 9-10 million viewers on Saturday night. Which is for a fraction of the cost of an episode of Casualty, we can get a lot of viewers for a lot less money, and to hell with the results. I do wonder what caused that change to suddenly think. It's because they could have very easily just carried on going, well, 10 million viewers a year. The viewing public know it's all a bit of a joke. We'll carry on doing what we're doing and send giant polystyrene trumpets across Europe.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a good point. I mean, why did it all come together with the personnel? I mean, I don't know enough, but with the new people in charge.
I mean, Lee Smethurst, I'm going to get his name wrong, but he's been at the helm for quite a while, hasn't he?
You probably know better than I do, Pete.
I thought his name had been around a lot longer than the last 2 years, but someone can correct me on that. I think the big problem that we've had is that the BBC have always announced one component at a time. I think so. That this obviously last year it was right. We're going to get the record industry to do it, and they're going to send us one of their best songwriters, and we got James Newman. Now James Newman is a very good songwriter, but by his own admission was sort of nowhere in terms of performance at the time, and so didn't do very well on that. And they didn't think about what they were going to do, so that's where I ended up with giant polystyrene trumpets. In other years, we've gone, right, we're going to do a national final, and everyone's gone, hooray, finally, it's going to be like Melodifest, and then it turns out to be 6 former X Factor contestants with songs derived from songwriting camps. It always seemed to me that year in, year out, the BBC would do one thing at a time and not put that whole package together. And with Sam, that's what they did, was they said, we've got this guy, he's a very good performer, he's got a huge following, we've got a very good song that he's been involved in writing, he will know how to perform this. And all of the stars aligned, as it were. Whereas I think in previous years, we just haven't, we've sort of picked a component of what it takes to do well and done that one thing in isolation.
I think the BBC don't really get the music side of it very well because, of course, they're a broadcaster rather than a music company. If you go back to the first question, where did it go wrong? I personally don't think it's anything to do with the language. I don't think that makes a difference. And I don't think it's Terry Wogan either. I think it was that once Jonathan King stopped being involved, there wasn't any further connection with the music industry in the way that he had done. Obviously, he's a very problematic person now, but that was.
I was about to say we don't really want him representing us.
Oh no, not at all. I didn't like him at the time, but he lifted up the level from the sort of Song for Europe you saw with Michael Ball and Sonia, where Paul Curtis was still sending songs in to Gina G, Katrina and the Waves. There was a big lift for a few years, and then after he departed, there didn't seem to be much of a mastermind on the music side, and I think that's really been missed.
And I think that's been. I think I said this last week, or maybe the week before, that up until the early '90s, the Song for Europe and the Eurovision in Britain was part of the light entertainment department. It wasn't part of the music department. So it was because obviously Eurovision's roots are in light entertainment from the mid-50s, but it seemed to have stuck with sort of Jim Moyer and the rest of the light entertainment department right up until, as you say, until Jonathan King took over. I can't say that Jonathan King made a success. Obviously, he pushed really hard for Love City Groove, and then it completely bombed. So he I wouldn't say he was that successful, but at the very least, he made a change to the type of songs that were coming through to the Song for Europe. What do we think of? How do we keep this going? What do we do next year?
I think in order to keep this momentum going, we kind of need to not replicate the same things, but I think we need to show the same level of commitment as we have now. We can't just go, okay, well, we did great. Let's take it a little bit easier. No, if anything, we need to go harder, more dedication, just whatever we think we can do even better than this year, just do it. And because I feel like for a lot of years, I don't think every single song we've sent has necessarily been a disaster or performer. I feel like we've often always got one element right, whether it's a good song with a performer who doesn't suit that song, or a good do you know what I mean? It's always been one element that's been good while the other hasn't worked, or a good song, good singer, but then we let it down on staging. We need to just continue with what we did this year, where we kind of hit it out at the park on every single aspect. No, there should be no room for complacency, especially when we're hosting.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I would worry more about future years. I think for 2023, I know host countries don't always do that well, but you cannot not see the BBC putting all the stops out, can you, for the host entry? They've got to come up with something special. They can't just come up with an Electro Velvet, can they, for Liverpool?
I don't think anyone wants an Electro Velvet. I don't think Electro Velvet wants to be Electro Velvet. No. So.
But you would hope they would put some effort into the entry as well as the hosting.
But that was always the interesting thing, was that when it came to Molly and Electro Velvet, this was the BBC saying, we are taking this very seriously. We're going to have this internal selection. We're going to do all these things. We're going to invite the cream of the record industry to come and take part. We'll have an official launch party. And then the next thing you know, you press the red button on a Tuesday afternoon, and there was Electro Velvet. So it just, as Lily said, we just seem to want to pick and choose what components of doing well we want to do, and it's this year or last year and this year, next year, we've got to try and tick all of the boxes. And that's sort of down to the artist, isn't it? And hopefully there'll be a sort of Sam Ryder effect, where a decent artist or someone on the Dua Lipa record label, not Dua Lipa, sorry, is it Tap Records? Are they in charge?
Yeah,
Tap Music, yeah.
Beg your pardon, Tap Music. They will have someone on their books who said, well, Sam's had a go, so now I do. Because otherwise we might go back to the way we used to. Because again, our last sort of peak and we had our last peak and trough was 20 years ago. Jessica Garlick came joint third, and then Gemini came dead last. So we really want to avoid a repeat of that.
I think it comes back to what I was saying before, and it ties in beautifully with what Lily was saying before. It's like we can't just rest on our laurels. We have to maintain the same effort, if not go even harder. It goes back to what I was saying. It's like we need to choose an artist who is willing to, obviously in their own way, willing to really put themselves out there and really show their commitment to this, like to the song, to the performance, to the outreach. Obviously with support from the BBC as well. And I would be hoping that the BBC, like obviously because the UK are hosting it next year, the BBC have a vested interest in this. So it is absolutely in their best interests to ensure that they choose someone who is going to be committed 110% the entire way.
One of the things that fans have often said for years is that we need a melodifestivalen style competition in the UK. And obviously our attempts at national finals in the last 10 to 15 years haven't been that successful with the You Decide format. Do you foresee a time when the BBC will head back towards the national final route? Or have we as fans now realised that it's actually better if we carry on the way we're going? Have we abandoned the whole? Because obviously there's a lot of fans who enjoy Melodifest, but we don't think the BBC could ever pull it off. And is that still the case?
I think maybe we'll see it sometime in the future, but now it's just not the right time to do that. I think while, opinions on Eurovision are changing here, I still think we've got a long way to go. And we need to get to a point where the contest is like, I mean, it's great that everyone's been optimistic about Eurovision this year, but we need to maintain that level of interest and enthusiasm before we're able to stage a national final of the same quality as Melodifestivalen.
I was going to say, I mean, adding on to Lily's point, I bring in the example of Australia. I mean, Australia started competing in 2015, but it wasn't until 2019 that Australia had introduced a national final. And funnily enough, next year they're reverting back to an internal selection. So I think the thing to consider is that it really depends on what that country and what that broadcaster decides to do in any particular year. They might feel, oh yes, we'll continue on with our national final, or they might decide for some reason, oh, we're going to go an internal selection. I mean, I'll give another example. Say for next year, Slovenia, they usually do their EMA, but next year they've decided to go with an internal selection and selected one of their most popular bands to represent them next year. Whether that works or not remains to be seen, but they've decided to take a risk and change their method of selection. Another thing to also remember, because all of these comparisons to Melodifestivalen and everything, you need to remember that Melodifestivalen has been Sweden's method of selection for the Eurovision song since 1960. So Melodifestivalen is a well-established part of the Swedish psyche. So it's always going to feature on SVT's rota every single year. Indeed, every year, the Melodifestivalen final is SVT's highest rating program, without a doubt. So again, it's a culture thing. And I think it touches on what Lily said. We in the UK, we need to make sure that we have had that Eurovision culture re-established first, and that level of enthusiasm to be really high before we even think about, okay, let's bring back in a national final. We have to maintain that momentum first and keep feeding the fire, so to speak. Everyone says like, oh, let's just go to this Melodifestivalen, but you've got to remember that Melodifestivalen itself has evolved over the years as well. It's like it used to be like many, like even as recent as 20 years ago, it used to be just like the one, used to be like the one evening, that's it. But then from about 2002 onwards. That's where it evolved into this arena tour around Sweden and bringing in, turning into this sort of family affair, and just and sort of involving the whole Swedish public.
I think Veronica, our usual co-host, is from Sweden, and she said last week it is something that children grow up with there, and it's a 6-week thing. So there is it does, as you've said, it becomes part of their psyche. I think the other big difference is they have artists who are happy to come back year after year and not win, not qualify for the final, get knocked out in the second chance round, and still return. I can't see a point in the UK, if the UK went back to a national final system, of saying, oh, well, I can't even think of an example now, but let's use the worst example we could get. I can't imagine Adele coming 7th at a Song for Europe 2028 and then deciding she was going to come back a year later. Whereas in the Melodifest, it's entirely acceptable to come 5th in the first semi-final and come back a little while later.
I was going to say the same point, Pete, as you made about what's in it for the losers. Because if you look back at UK history, you've got the Song for Europe 76 and 1995, which were both big relaunches, lots of competitors, a few famous names. They couldn't maintain that because the losers don't get anything from it. It's embarrassing to be Tony Christie and not win, or Samantha Fox and not win.
Well, cheap plug incoming. I recently interviewed Paul Griggs, who took part in 2 Song for Europes, and he said that if you lose the Song for Europe, you did not get record sales. When he wrote a song in '86 for Chad Brown that came 7th, and his publisher assured him it would still be a hit, and it sank because no one who win. In fact, I think even the guys who came 2nd at a Song for Europe '86 were promised a record deal and then was never released. So in Britain, and I think again, Brotherhood of Man were meant to take part in one of the 80s Song for Europes and then decided we'd rather be known as the winners of Eurovision rather than the guys who flopped out in the Song for Europe. So, Veronica, you might know better than us then. Why is it that Swedish artists are willing to go and lose year in, year out and still come back to it? Whereas in Britain, I can't see anyone doing badly in a national final and then coming back to it a year later.
I think it has to do with...
I'm asking you to speak for an entire nation now. I appreciate that.
I understand. But it's just, for me, it comes down to connotations. And I mean, it does come down to the technicalities of the recording contract as well. But the viewership is so much bigger for Melodifestivalen that you get that guaranteed exposure. So you've monetized the A&R process. And that works. Whereas we don't have those same systems in place in the UK for Song for Europe. So I think that plays a big part in it, without having looked at the record contract specifically myself.
Why not? Because, but I think even that's changed a little bit, because famously Elizabeth Andreasen got knocked out in 1984, and it nearly killed her career. And if it wasn't for Bobby Socks a year later, it would have sort of ended her. From what I've read, but it's interesting that you can come 6th in the Melodifest first round and still sort of make a career. And Loreen, obviously, is the most famous one, who got knocked out of the Andrew Shanson competition to a song that everyone felt wasn't very good, and she's back this year. And I wonder what drives people to do it, and it may well be recording contracts, as you say.
Well, I mean, Lorraine was a big artist even before the win in 2010. Did a huge career, and a lot of the artists that end up there, obviously UK audiences may not have heard of them, but they are relatively big artists. Publications and media around it are bigger. You hear about it a lot sooner. You hear about it months in advance. So there's a huge build-up as well, even for the lesser-known artists.
Approach to music instead of using like songwriting camps. So I think, for example, like Melodifestivalen or Melodi Grand Prix from Norway where I'm from, it's kind of like the whole national panel itself is kind of a concept, is a tradition. Everyone watches it, and this has been built since 1960, so it's like a big thing. But I think not trying to build as an event like that in just a few years is quite difficult. But maybe looking at like Finland, for example, or maybe Festival de Canção in Portugal could be maybe something to look at for UK in the future if they decide to do a new national final. But in the meantime, I think it's going to be internal selection until we get that positive outlook on the contest and the Eurovision culture in general among the public.
Yeah. And how much of the UK outlook is, we're now nearly 15 years down the line since Terry stopped doing it, and the results haven't improved. We've had a language rule for 25 years. If you remove those from the equation, why is the UK attitude to it still reasonably poor, albeit it's got improved this year? And how do we change that? Do we just is the casual viewers' enjoyment of Eurovision and not deriding it dependent on us being successful?
No, I was just going to say, I think it goes both ways. I think they both depend on each other to an extent, because I think if an artist is successful, I think the enthusiasm is going to go up. If the enthusiasm's up, it will inspire future artists to do their best and be successful. So yeah, again, it's that self-fulfilling cycle there. Going back to what you were asking though about like why were we doing so, I think the point I was trying to get across earlier, and I may not have conveyed this fully correctly. Going back to sort of like the Terry Wogan years. And I think so, like when you have someone as prominent as Terry Wogan doing commentary, and he is saying all this negative stuff about Eurovision, and it feeds into the psyche of the viewing public. The viewing public then start to internalize that, and then they think, oh yeah, Eurovision's just not worth it. And then the BBC then see, oh yeah, the viewing public, like, yeah, we're still getting kind of good viewing numbers, but the attitude's just not really there. And then the BBC is like, oh, well, yeah, we're one of the big five. We still have to contribute. Let's just go in and just go through the motions. So I think it was just, it's a perception. I think it is very much a perception thing. And again, this is why I think Terry Wogan has a lot to answer for on that front. But, and yes, I know other people disagree on this, but this is something I very, very, very strongly believe. But in saying that, I think obviously with Sam's success this year, I think it has definitely got to the point now where like the viewing public do want to do well, and they want to see an artist who does well. I'll recount a sort of a personal example of this. I remember being in Turin this year for the contest, and a lot of my my non-hardcore Eurovision fans who were texting me during the grand final when the points were being announced, and then and then all the jury points were happening, and then UK got their first 12, and I was like, oh yay, we got some points. And then more and more 12s started coming through the UK, and they were going like, "What the fuck is going on?" It's like they couldn't believe what was happening, and I think it's that excitement that, oh my God, the UK can actually do really well again. I think this is what will break us out of that negative psyche that we've had for all these years and inspire us to do well again. So yeah, it comes back to what I was saying about it's a perpetuating vicious cycle. If we can break that cycle, that's going to already get us halfway there to being as successful as the UK was many moons ago.
I'm going to offer a counter argument to Terry, because I remember a long time ago, Christer Bjorkman said shortly after Terry died that he was one of the reasons why the UK didn't take it very seriously. Is part of it that there was a period towards the end of Terry's time where there were Ukrainians wrapped in tinfoil and Latvians pretending to be pirates and so on and so on, and he was reflecting the national psyche of an audience of people going, what in the name of God is this? And then actually his derision was essentially a reflection of what the casual viewer thought. Rather than him telling the audience, this is crap and you must hate it, he was essentially just reflecting what was actually being said or being thought.
I think that's right. If you look back at the history, Eurovision was never credible in the UK. If you look back at press reports or some of the work that's been done about audience reactions to the early days, it was never credible. I think for two reasons: one, it didn't produce a lot of hits in the UK charts, and secondly, it's a strange format for a British TV programme. We don't watch 3 hours of one thing of an evening with 20 songs in a row. So it's a strange event by UK standards, and it was well watched, but people didn't take it seriously. And Terry reflected that, I think, much more than in any way led it. And often he defended it when it wasn't when it was being properly attacked. And I think there were stages at different points in the late 80s or 90s where people really watched it in the UK for Terry, who was much more popular as a broadcaster than Eurovision as a format. I think he saved UK Eurovision.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to defend him completely, because there's times, particularly in the Song for Europe, where he said this is all a pile of crap, and then gone right, song number 3, and then introduced the next singer. And I always felt sorry for the poor person on stage who had to listen to Terry in a tuxedo, sort of deriding the thing they were all competing for. So I shan't defend him too hard, but yeah, I agree that the BBC must have thought he is our audience selling point. He's why people come into this. But I think if you're an artist, this is probably not what you want to be a part of.
My opinion on Terry Wogan, for what it's worth, I thought he went from sort of being gently whimsical, for want of a better phrase, just taking the gentle piss out of songs, and then it sort of went on a sliding scale down until I think the last few years. I understand what you're saying, Pete, but I thought it was more to do with the voting that really. It really made him incredibly sour the last few years.
Yeah,
but he did definitely change over the years. Yeah.
I mean, his disgust for what happened to Andy Abraham was palpable on the night.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah, I just want to add in that, I agree with that. I think that while I think Terry did reflect some of the attitudes that were felt towards the more outlandish parts of the contest in that era, I do think there were times though, and increasingly towards the end of his reign, where things just got incredibly sour and bitter, and it went from being a light-hearted jokiness to just a sour taste. And I do think that we've seen criticism of Graham Norton in recent years kind of slipping into that, not as much. So I just hope that it doesn't go back that way. I know in the last 2 years or so, Graham's kind of, taken a more positive approach, like how he started. And I hope he maintains that, because I'd hate to see the same thing repeated. Because, Eurovision is a bit outlandish. It is a bit kish. But, that's the joy of it. There's a bit of everything.
Are there, I don't know if anyone would even know the answer to this, but are the other nations' commentators, do they have their own Terrys? I can't, or are they more respectful to the whole thing?
I've never seen an equivalent.
Yeah. There was a Dutch guy, wasn't there, a few years ago, Paul, the one who tried to chat up. Sakis. He was a bit.
But he
off,
did it for quite a long time as well.
Is that someone else?
Paul De Leo, was it something like that?
Oh, okay. No, sorry. I was just going to say, in terms of your hosts and sort of the reputation and stuff. Australia had a bit of a very interesting situation. So up until 2008, Australia always relied on the BBC telecast. So they always got the Terry Wogan commentary. So which led to, again, some similar attitudes coming up in Australia over the years. Although Australia loved the contest, but then SBS, the multicultural broadcaster in Australia, decided from 2009 onwards to send their own commentary team across. So we had a pair of very funny peeps called Sam Pang and Julia Zamiro. Very, very very amusing. They started the same year, coincidentally, that Graham Norton started doing the commentating, and they very much took the very ironic approach to their commentary, sort of like taking the gentle piss out of songs and all that kind of stuff, going like, oh, ha ha, funny costumes, ha 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 ha, which was kind of endearing to a point. But then when Australia, this is where it all kind of started going a bit weird. When Australia started competing in that 2015, they were still kind of maintaining that, like, oh yeah, let's just be completely unironic about everything. But then when Australia almost won the following year, and then Australia was starting to get a lot more serious about the contest. It was not officially, they stood down the following year, both of them, and it wasn't completely officially acknowledged, but it was sort of like understood that they felt that they couldn't actually continue to commentate when Australia was taking the contest seriously. They felt that they were not able to do sort of to be sort of their unironic selves anymore. So it was like, and I think Julia Zemiro has been quoted in interviews over the years saying like, oh yeah, look, if Australia stops competing in the contest, I'm happy to commentate so I can start taking the piss out of it again. Yeah, but
I didn't know that.
But since then we've got an absolutely like hilarious duo in Joel Creasy and Miff Warhurst. They're absolutely hilarious. Like they take the piss out of it, but you could tell they absolutely love the contest. It shines through every single year.
I'm going to sidestep onto a slightly different topic now. No, sort of related. Ireland have announced their Euro song will be in February. They've had a very successful period and then have struggled a lot. What do they need to do to turn things around?
No, I was just going to say again. I think it's good that RTE are actually making an effort again to go to some sort of national final selection, even if it was just like one night on the Late Show. And to be fair, even though Brooke ultimately didn't qualify for the grand final in Turin, her performance on the night on stage was really, really good. And it was actually she herself has a lot of potential ahead of her. But I think it's always the case with these things. It will take Ireland a bit of time just to try and find their feet again. Kind of think similar to what the UK had been going through the last few years until Sam did what he did this year. But I think if they. It's encouraging to see that RTE are actually continuing with that. Like, even though Brooke didn't make the grand final, the fact that RTE have said, let's still continue with this, it indicates that it seems that they've got a bit of a long-term strategy happening. So I am hoping that they'll maybe make some tweaks to the format or whatever, but let's see what happens. I'm eagerly looking forward to what they'll bring to the table next year.
But it's interesting that we've just said that the United Kingdom needs a number of years of successful internally chosen artists before we can even think about doing a national final, whereas Ireland have had a number of years of internally selected artists not doing very well and now reverted back to the Late Show as their selection method. So I just found that really interesting that we've sort of said we definitely can't do that until we sort of get our house in order.
I just want to add in that I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned, which I meant to mention earlier, was that I'm actually really impressed with the BBC's approach to Eurovision post-contest. Usually it's a case of, okay, the show's over, let's forget about it for another year. We'll pop up sometime in March and then, then it'll be silence again until the show rolls around. Yeah. I think the fact that they seem to be really committed to giving Sam Ryder opportunities is just great. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to be doing as well, to be making representing the UK an attractive thing to other artists, especially like the New Year's Eve show is going to be a massive deal for him. That's probably again one of the most watched things. And even like today after Junior Eurovision, like I kept the BBC on for a while and they were playing his songs on like adverts and all sorts, not just like Spaceman. And I was like, this is incredible. I could not imagine them doing this for any other artist in the past like 20 years or so. So
no, you're right.
We really need to keep doing that.
Because I think, again, going back into history, Ray Caruana from Live Report said that the minute Yugoslavia won, there was not a BBC person to be seen, and they were just sort of dropped off at the airport, and that was that. And I sometimes, I don't know, I always thought this is just how my anxious mind works. But I was thinking about Michael Rice, who'd had a week with a load of BBC people, and then got the plane home, and the next thing you know, he was just back in his house with his mum and sister, and that was that, and the BBC phone never rang again. So yeah, no, I think you're exactly right that the BBC's approach to sort of keeping Sam involved in things is hopefully means that new artists will go, well, if I do this and if I do well at it, I can get a New Year's show, or I can turn up on Strictly.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think even that they have to do like second place every year to get these opportunities.
No.
I think there should always be some form of opportunities for people, especially because in previous years, a lot of the entrants we've entered have been relatively unknown.
Yeah.
And I think going from that massive high of competing at Eurovision on such a huge stage to then just being dropped, that must be crushing. Yeah. If I was in that position, I don't know how I would handle that.
But again, it's that thing that we need to treat. If we send a good artist with a good song and they come 14th, then we need to accept that that's just the way it is. And again, in other countries, not winning it and not coming top 10 doesn't kill you as much as we seem to think it would be. And I hope we can change that attitude. Patrick, you started us off, so I'll let you have the last word as you've had your hand up.
No, that's all right. It was just to be a very quick note from me. It goes back to just a very quick thing to add about the national finals song for Europe and sort of the reputation that it that artists had with in terms of competing. I think one thing that we haven't really sort of factored into it in this day and age is the power of social media as well. And I think that's definitely something to keep in mind. I think even if now you were to go into like a national final and you would compete with a song, you would still there's still a chance that song may still become very successful. I mean, look at Snap this year. I mean, it came 20th in the grand final, and it's now the most played song out of this year's contest. So yeah, don't underestimate the power of social media.
And in the UK, the Common Linnets outsold Conchita Wurst in terms of the UK top 20. So winning is not necessarily the answer to everything.
Exactly.